1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Hello out there in Facebook land. Got a couple people here. My name is Brent Jensen, and I have a strong connection with Paul Desmond. And with all of this extra time that the pandemic has given us, I've had a chance to kind of go back, do some reading about Desmond, a little bit of research. There's been some activity with Paul's music recently. There's a wonderful mosaic, if you're familiar with the mosaic set, box sets. They release previously unreleased or complete collections of jazz musicians, and there's one of all of the music that he had done, or a lot of it, that he had done in Toronto with Don Thompson doing the recording, bass player Don Thompson, and it's in a box set now, and something like 5 hours of previously unreleased material. So Paul Desmond is a very, very popular guy. I learned that by doing a release on Origin Records. My first release was dedicated to Paul Desmond, and it was called the Sound of a Dry Martini, which was Desmond's quip, where he had been quoted as saying he was trying to get the sound of a dry martini. And so I kind of took that and ran with it, being as it was my debut CD, and nobody would have known who I was. And so I did a tribute to somebody who was always kind of a part of my sound. I've been very influenced by the West Coast so-called cool school players, specifically Lee Konitz, who I studied with, and early on Paul Desmond, because in my teen years I had listened to some of the Paul Desmond recordings that were on the CTI Creed Taylor's label in the 1970s, and had been influenced by his playing, and of course all the stuff that he did with Dave Brubeck as well. I had severely underestimated Paul Desmond's popularity, however, because after releasing that CD that I did almost 20 years ago now, it was in 2002, we had to reprint it twice. And most recently, it was just released as it wasn't quite 20 years, but John Bishop at Origin Records called it a 20th anniversary. And it's currently now, I mean, it continues to be very popular. That CD is now on jazz radio stations. It's playing across the country. It's been in the top 100 for the last 5 or 6 weeks. And so Paul Desmond's enduring popularity. He's an interesting guy, and I figured there's actually a lot of material to talk about with Paul Desmond. So I decided to break it up into a couple Mondays and call them DesMondays. And I was going to talk a little bit about some of his early recordings, and also point you in directions of, if you are Paul Desmond fans, I can kind of point you in the direction of some great books, some literature. There's a lot of stuff online. There's actually some stuff that's kind of difficult to find online. There's a 30-minute show that he did in Canada when he was playing with the Canadian musicians, and it's actually embedded in an article online, but you can't find it on YouTube as such. The people that had done that TV show, I think, just gave the writer the rights to use it and put it in his article, but it only links to that from his article. So I'll give you all that information as well. I'm gonna wait to see. Don't have anybody. Only a few people out there playing. The tune that I just played was, of course, Paul Desmond's biggest hit was Take 5, which he did with the Dave Brubeck Quartet in 1959 on the album Time Out. The song I just played was called Take 10. His attempt to make a little bread off of the sequel, and it never quite took off. Take 10 also in 5/4 time, very similar to Take 5. It was on one of the first records that he did, not the first, but one of the first records he did with guitarist Jim Hall. Paul and Dave Brubeck had a kind of a gentleman's agreement that whenever Paul did a recording, so as not to kind of confuse the stuff he had been doing with the quartet, which featured Dave on piano, of course, he would use a guitarist. And so there are several recordings of that he did on RCA Victor with Jim Hall, some great recordings that he did in the early 60s. His first one was in 1959. I think it was called First Place Again. And that was one of his first quartet recordings. This one I just played was Take 10. That was the title track off of Take 10. And there's another tune that's an original of, probably none of them compared to Take 5 as far as popularity. And as far as royalties, too. Take 5 did so well that Paul, upon his retirement from the Dave Brubeck Quartet, was able to pretty much live upon the royalties he was receiving from Take 5. But there is another really nice tune. They've been playing it every so often on KNKX. I did a KNKX studio session, which you can find on YouTube, which was about the tribute that I do to Paul Desmond called Pure Desmond. And I featured this particular tune. This is a song called Embarcadero. Paul was from the Bay Area. Embarcadero's famous section of San Francisco. And this one actually has lyrics to it. A couple years ago, I did a concert in Bellevue for the East Side Jazz Club and had Gail Pettis sing the words. There is no recorded versions of it. Should probably do it at some point. But the words were written by Paul's father, and who was also a musician, classical organist. Taught Paul a lot of, about music, harmony, and counterpoint and so forth. But this tune is a short little version of Embarcadero. It's a bossa nova piece. It was on the Take 10 album. Same one as, and hopefully the sound, I've been messing around with the sound here, so we'll see. I've been trying to find the best placement. I've got a fairly decent microphone here for it, but I have to not get too close to it. So here we go. So a nice little bossa nova tune by Paul. If you are a fan of Paul Desmond, which there are many, if you go online and you look around anywhere, you will see all sorts of like saxophone blogs and chat rooms and threads. I've noticed myself, I've popped up in a couple of them when they talk about Paul Desmond. And so there's actually quite a few instrumentalists. I've run into several saxophone students of my own that have been very interested in Paul Desmond. There's a great book that's no longer available in book form. It sold out. It's kind of coffee table, as you can see. Very large, heavy coffee table style book here by Doug Ramsey, who was a great friend of Paul Desmond. Had hung out with Paul Desmond quite a bit. Did the liner notes for my Dry Martini CD, actually. Some wonderful liner notes. That's why I was glad we got our CD reprinted, mostly because it's been available streaming for quite a while. But Doug's liner notes were not available. The CD was out of print for almost 10 years or something like that. So until we just recently redid it, and it's had kind of a second life. But Paul was a very private person, and so he didn't. A lot of people that even were close to him didn't really know a lot about his personal life, and so Doug did a lot of research, and you find out a lot about that. In fact, the lead sheet for Embarcadero, the tune I just played, was in this particular book. There's several transcriptions that were done by different alto saxophonists, Bud Shank and Gary Foster and John Handy, and I was very honored to be included upon this. I did one on Sacra Blues, which was a blues solo that he did back in the late 50s on a quartet recording he did with a brass player, played mellophone actually, Don Elliott. And the Sacra Blues transcriptions in here that I had done. It's available as an e-book, so you can get it in Kindle versions and Nook and that type of thing, but you can't really get this type, except for I found it in some places on eBay. It's quite inflated prices, so you can find this stuff, you can find them out there, but they're very difficult to locate. The book itself is not available anymore. there's a lot of transcriptions books I've actually found of his solos. There's about 4, I think, that are out there. The background tracks that I've just been playing on the last couple tunes were from this one published by Hal Leonard. So they have 10 jazz favorites of Paul Desmond's. And that one had Take 10 in it, which I just did a moment ago. So I'll give you some different leads and things that could kind of be your tour guide for Paul Desmond. I know there's lots of stuff online, lots of musicians that are doing these things now with the pandemic. It's kind of made us reimagine what we're doing with live music. The Village Vanguard just this last weekend started doing live performances there. They charge $7 for access, and they do them on Saturday nights and Sunday afternoons. Billy Hart's Quartet with Ethan Iverson, Mark Turner, and Ben Street. Some wonderful playing, really good audio and video quality from there. Smalls Jazz Club in New York has been doing stuff there. Spike Woolner has been producing that virtually every day. I think that goes almost every day in the afternoon. It's kind of an odd time. It's around 5 o'clock. Something around 5 o'clock New York time, I think. And then there's a club here in close to Seattle in North Bend, Washington, Boxley's, and that's jazzclubsnorthwest.org. You can find their broadcast every Friday night and Saturday. And I'm playing this Saturday night, June 20th. I'm going to play some Paul Desmond music. I've got some music associated with alto saxophonists that I'm going to be doing. So a little bit of Paul, a little bit of Lee Konitz, a little bit of Art Pepper, all alto saxophonists who have kind of informed my playing and sound, style, concept, and so forth. That's one thing. Paul is a very lyrical player coming directly out of Lester Young. I don't think you can find very many other players that come quite so directly. Lee Konitz certainly does, but with really kind of a lyrical type of playing. There was a seismic shift in jazz that happened with Charlie Parker and John Coltrane and really affected the pedagogy too, and the approach specifically by saxophonists too, very very theoretically dense kind of music with lots of scale chord theory and stuff, and almost all of the jazz improvisation is kind of based on that. It's really a much different approach. It's much more of a lyrical approach. Lee Konitz really emphasized singing quite a bit and would have me sing in lessons. I have my own students do that too, to try to keep it so that it's this lyrical kind of song-like way of approaching the improvisation instead of it being a real kind of mechanical type of way of playing. And I think certainly Paul stays true to that. There's a video on YouTube I was just watching where a guy kind of compares him to classical composers, and specifically Bach, and how his use of, and you can hear it a lot in the earlier days of the Dave Brubeck Quartet before he became famous with Time Out. This is before the famous Dave Brubeck Quartet was the one with Joe Morello on drums and Eugene Wright on bass. But all of the jazz goes to college type of stuff. In 1953, there was this Jazz at Oberlin recording. And some of those early recordings in the early 50s, you can really hear a little bit more energetic Paul Desmond, almost bop-like, a little bit more notes, going on. And there was also a lot more of the kind of counterpoint, a contrapuntal interplay that was very similar to Bach that was going on. There's a YouTube one called How Paul Desmond Improvised Counterpoint Like J.S. Bach. It's a YouTube page that's called Sharp 11 Music. There's actually a lot of transcriptions on there, and there's about a 10-minute video, and he points out places where Desmond is using these devices that were common in Bach's playing as well. And you hear it in the early recordings, the earlier recordings of Paul Desmond and Dave Brubeck. They would engage in that type of thing. And there's even an interview someplace where they asked Paul about that, and he almost seemed sort of remorseful that they had gotten away from that they weren't doing as much of that in the later years, and as they started to have hits, things like Take Five and Blue Rondo a la Turk and arrangements that they would do and so forth, and it didn't have as much. It wasn't quite as loose, and the early stuff, and there was some stuff that they did while they were all. Dave went to school at I believe it was, I think it was Mills College in California, and so he was studying composition with Darius Milhaud, and so all of this is heard a lot more in the early style of Paul Desmond's stuff. But in 1953, if you go to the that particular album, I got thinking about that album because I found online, here's some more Paul Desmond artifacts. I was looking for a poster, and there's this little ad from 1955, and this is, "Only a Selmer can do so much for your playing. Proof, listen to Paul Desmond." There's the, right there. Whoops, where was it? Right there. It's Jazz at Oberlin. So that Jazz Goes to College series. And the first track on there, at least when you stream it, is These Foolish Things. And if you listen to Paul's solo, he gets pretty notey, pretty rambunctious, and it sounds a little, bebop-esque. There's also a little bit of that, the counterpoint type of thing is definitely happening. This is that earlier quartet before he had Joe Morello in the group. This is 53, so this is a good 6 years before that group starts up. So I'll do a little. This is just a bass line that's playing along here. There's a wonderful play-along series by UK bassist Peter Ind, I-N-D. Peter Ind did a play-along series called Time for Improvisation, and you can find them on YouTube and Spotify and all that. And this is a little bass line on These Foolish Things. So I'll try to get in the right spot here to get the balance going. But this is These Foolish Things, and I'll try to get a little Desmond-like on the...
1, 2, 3, 4.
Foolish Things. And if you listen to that recording, there's a couple recordings of Desmond, some earlier recordings of These Foolish Things where he's really getting quite baroque, in his approach. Much more activity than later on, where he kind of pares things down. It's much more edited a little bit later on. And there's also a great version of it with Jerry Mulligan, because as he moved away, the majority of his recordings were, of course, with Dave Brubeck, and his association with Brubeck started early, like the late 40s. It was in 1948 or something like that, some of the first recordings. And then 59 is, of course, when Time Out comes out with Take 5, and that's really kind of launches them to this other level. And then they were just touring constantly until they basically, the whole band just wore out. They broke up just mostly from fatigue, according to Desmond. And Desmond really didn't do anything for several years after that. It was in the late 60s. And he was content to live on his royalties from Take 5. He was doing quite well in his apartment that he lived in Manhattan, and spent a lot of time at Elaine's, which was a popular bar where a lot of writers hung out, and he sort of fancied himself a writer, or wanted to be a writer. And you can find an article that he had written about the Dave Brubeck Quartet, which was supposed to be the beginnings of a book that he was doing, which never came to fruition before his passing. But so he kind of slummed around, kind of wanting to be writing. He said he found it interesting all the writers wanted to be musicians, and he as the musician wanted to be a writer, and he decided I better go back to what I'm best at. And that's when he started playing with the Canadians, and as I mentioned, that box set on Mosaic, which I am anxiously awaiting. I just got an email today that it should be within the next week. Because of the pandemic, there's been a lot of trouble getting things shipped out. So hopefully we'll be getting that pretty soon. But check that out. You can go to Mosaic Records, to their website, and it's their most recent box set, the 1975 Toronto recordings of Paul Desmond. And they've also been remastered, so the sound quality is a little bit better. There was a couple that were out in bootleg form. I think one of them was called Radio Live or something like that. And I'm sure it was highly illegal, and it hadn't gotten any of the clearances from like the Desmond's estate or anything like that. And the recording quality was less than optimal. So, but that's kind of the early years of Paul. He's playing when he gets away from the Brubeck. It's just in between tours and in between engagements that he's doing with Brubeck. He's so busy with Brubeck that he was able to wedge a few recordings in the late 50s and early 60s with Jerry Mulligan. And in fact, that book that I had mentioned before, so I have a couple of them. I bought another one. There's 3 transcription books that I found on Paul Desmond. This one is just a Paul Desmond collection, also on Hal Leonard. There's no CD with this one. These are just the transcriptions, and a little bit of writing about them as well. So they have some analysis. There's another one that is available not only in hard copy but electronically, and it does have a CD, but it's even much more so focused in on very specific transcriptions. The CD doesn't have play-alongs where you can just play along with the rhythm track. It's a re-recording of a saxophonist playing Desmond's pieces, which that's also on this one too. There's a track where there's a saxophonist playing along with him, and then one where it's just the rhythm section by itself. And this other book, Paul Desmond book, has really detailed analysis, just little sections of the different solos and so forth. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you can find. The one that's most people think of when they think of the Desmond and Mulligan recordings was an album called Two of a Mind, and they had a version of All the Things You Are, which that's what they're doing here. They're recreating it with the piano, so you don't get to hear the bari sax, unfortunately. But I'll go ahead and do All the Things You Are. They had split it between Paul and Jerry, and so you really hear kind of the classical approach where it's like a counterpoint fugal kind of thing. There's only bass and drums on those recordings too, so it highlights the line. It's more linear harmony because you don't have any chord instrument like a guitar or piano or anything. So this is All the Things You Are, and somewhat in this style. The piano's playing Jerry Mulligan's part in here.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
So they even include the little ending, that little descending scale thing. That's what you'll hear on the Mulligan on the Two of a Mind recording. And those are some of my favorite Desmond recordings. I would say the stuff he did with Jerry Mulligan. And was reading an interview recently. I'll give you some of these links. There's quite a few things that have been posted fairly recently, within the last year or less. There's a bunch of stuff that was posted at the same time as the Mosaic set was released, and so when that came out, they kind of reissued some of the liner notes. Don Thompson's liner notes are available. The bass player that was on those recordings, he's actually the recording engineer too, and he basically had a little portable recording setup that he did, and which fortunately allowed us to have a lot more late Paul Desmond recordings. In 75, he dies in 77, so this is right toward the end. Some of those recordings he was doing with that group. And in fact, let's see, what did it, yeah, there's a website called jazzhistoryonline.com. So at jazzhistoryonline.com, you'll find there's several different little articles, and it was Paul Desmond and the Canadians. That's the title of that particular article. But if you go to jazzhistoryonline.com /Paul-Desmond-Canadians / that takes you directly to that. That's a kind of a little treasure hunt that you can do, because there is a half-hour television show from Canada, which previously, if you look at YouTube, all you'll find is, so I knew it existed someplace. All you'll find is an interview portion. It's about a 10-minute interview where he sits down and very uncomfortably he's kind of, kind of a little twitchy and nervous and kind of, doesn't seem very comfortable just speaking on the camera with the interview with the woman who's doing the interview with him. But it's about 10 minutes long. That's all you can find on YouTube. They've embedded in this article on the Paul Desmond and the Canadians on jazzhistoryonline.com the entire show. So there's a version of Take 5, recording of Wendy, and I think Just Squeeze Me. So there's 3 full recordings, and then his 10-minute interview, which was the only part I had seen before, and a very lengthy section on that whole time period and what was going on with the recording that he did with Ed Bickert, Jerry Fuller on drums, and Don Thompson on bass. And so I strongly advise, if you're a Desmond fan, go to jazzhistoryonline.com, look for that Paul Desmond and the Canadians, and if you scroll down for, and it's a very long article, just scroll down, embedded in that article is it's basically YouTube, but it's only there. You can't find it on YouTube if you do a search. You just click on it, and it's the entire half-hour show. So it's when he was there playing at a club called Bourbon Street in Toronto, and so this was on a Toronto local television, probably like their version of PBS or something like that, or cable access channel or something. They had a regular jazz show, and so it's really quite a find, because there's not very much Paul Desmond, especially that later period, and really none of him with that quartet on film. So it's kind of cool finding that particular little section that's there. Some of the other things, there's another website called Jazz Profiles, and if you just jazzprofiles.blogspot.com, and you can enter into the search engine Paul Desmond. And there's several different Paul Desmond things. There's a very long piece by Gene Lees, L-E-E-S. Gene Lees was a jazz critic, writer, a poet. He wrote a lot of lyrics to jazz tunes. I think he wrote the lyrics to Bill Evans' Waltz for Debbie, I believe. He actually wrote lyrics for several musicians' music, and he might have done it. I don't think he did it for Paul Desmond stuff, but for tunes that just were instrumental and didn't have any lyrics written. So Gene Lees was a lyricist as well. And there's a very long piece about him and his interactions and some funny stories about him and Paul Desmond, and that's at jazzprofiles.blogspot.com. So that's a jazz blog, basically. And one of them is Paul Desmond, Another Perspective. That's the one that has the Gene Lees stuff on it. And also at the jazzprofiles.blogspot.com, they have the entry for the complete 1975 Toronto recordings, Paul Desmond. And those are, they had, with permission from Don Thompson, his bass player, the reprint of the lyrics. So in the booklet that comes with the mosaic set, there's liner notes by Don Thompson talking about his interactions with Paul Desmond. And the cool thing about that box set too is there's a whole section. Ed Bickert's, I believe, father was sick or something, so there was one night it must have been at Bourbon Street, and one night of the gig, Ed Bickert couldn't make it, and so Rob Mcconnell, valve trombone, also known famously for Rob Mcconnell and the Boss Brass, big band from Canada. Rob Mcconnell came in, who was very much a lyrical, kind of almost cool school type of player, I guess you could say, kind of coming out of the Lester Young influence. And it's just those two horns. So it's a lot like the Jerry Mulligan stuff. It's trombone and alto sax, the bass and drums. So there's a couple CDs in that set that are just of that particular night when Ed Bickert wasn't there. So that's kind of a cool addition, because those had previously, I don't think those have been, maybe there was some bootleg cassettes going around someplace, but very difficult to find those things anyhow. So let's see, I've got, there's also Paul Desmond went through kind of a bossa nova phase in 1964. That's when Stan Getz did the recording with Girl from Ipanema, the jazz samba recording, and Desafinado and all of those things. And so he had an album called Bossa Antigua. But I think I'll do that maybe next week, because I'm going to go ahead and do these, even if nobody shows up. And I'll even post it. I've also put on my PayPal account. So for any of you that are out there, and if you enjoy the playing and any of the information and stuff that we're talking about with Paul Desmond, and you feel so inclined, that's kind of the electronic tip jar, paypal.me/B Jensen Jazz. Much appreciated. I'm, not doing as, I'm not having as big a problem as some of my musician friends who I didn't play that many gigs anyway. I only had a few students, and most of those have converted over to Zoom. So we've been doing Zoom private lessons. And I teach part-time at a high school with a jazz band, so I've been able to continue that kind of work, even though it's been online. And we've been doing some kind of class Zoom type of things. That's coming to an end. This is the last week of school. However, I also worked at both the stadiums here in Seattle. Tomorrow night would have been a nine-game homestand by the Mariners. That's not happening. So obviously no T-Mobile Park work for anybody that works, for the Mariners. There's been no work at CenturyLink, and that's usually in the summer where that picks up quite a bit. So, feeling that a little bit. So once again, anything in the tip jar would be appreciated. And again, let me remind you that there is several online, a lot of jazz clubs trying to kind of adapt to the circumstances. So Boxley's in North Bend every Friday and Saturday night, and they keep those posted on their Facebook page. There's a Facebook page, Jazz Clubs Northwest. Also, Danny Kolke, Kolke, he is the owner, the proprietor there at Boxley's. He also runs the Jazz Clubs Northwest nonprofit organization up there. They do a lot of great things for the music program. Mount Size High School, a jazz band. They're very interactive with the program that's up there in Snoqualmie. They just performed on a virtual Essentially Ellington last week. They had the Essentially Ellington Festival. So I'm going to be playing in Boxley's live, 8 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I'll be doing several Paul Desmond things, some Lee Konitz stuff, some Art Pepper. It's going to be kind of tribute to the alto players. I believe Danny Kolke is playing piano, Greg Williamson on drums, and probably Chris Seimer, I believe. I think Chris Seimer is playing bass. So that's this Saturday night. One of my few and far between live gigs. I was very fortunate. Earshot Jazz, I was really appreciative that they gave me the opportunity to do a tribute to Lee Konitz. Those have been posted on both my Brent Jensen page and my B Jensen Jazz page, a tribute to Lee Konitz. It was shortly after Lee passed away due to complications from COVID-19. Passed away on April 15th. And so we did a Lee Konitz tribute. So let's see, I think I gave you all those. One other place that I found a very lengthy liner notes. It's on Indiana Public Media. It's probably for their public radio station, indianapublicmedia.org. And there's a Brubeck Paul Desmond in the 1970s. It talks about Paul Desmond in the 1970s and the recordings that he was doing with CTI, and it kind of leads into also that album, Pure Desmond. Pure Desmond was probably one of my first introductions to Paul. That came out in, I think, 1974, maybe, or 70, right around that time, 75. So I was 14 or 15 when that album came out. My dad worked at an elementary school, and the janitor there was from New York and a big jazz fan. And he found out that my dad, had a kid who was studying just in lab band and, playing jazz. And so he would send records home periodically, and he would record them on cassettes, and then he didn't have any use for the records because he liked to play cassettes in his car and stuff. So he would say, here, take these to your kid. And a lot of those were CTI albums. I remember Paul Desmond, Pure Desmond, also She Was Too Good to Me. It was a Chet Baker album. Concerto by Jim Hall that featured Chet Baker and Paul Desmond. Chet Baker, I would say, is another big influence on me. The lyrical player, so it's a very different approach than this kind of pyrotechnical, really the style that kind of came into vogue specifically with John Coltrane. And in some of these readings, the things that I've given you, those the blog spots, the jazz profiles, and in the book by Doug Ramsey, Paul does sort of tip his hand to how he was feeling about it. Said he thought it was a strange phenomenon that was going on because he was right in the middle of it with Charlie Parker in the 1940s, and in the late 40s into the early 50s, how it seemed to almost be like the secret handshake, or if you didn't sound like Charlie Parker, you were initially sort of shunned. It was like, well, why are you doing? And he was doing something completely different. He and Lee Konitz both different sound and different approach, and really a different vocabulary than what Parker was doing. And he expresses some feeling of, I kind of wish I could do that, and listening to him and trying to embrace it, but it just wasn't his style. It wasn't his way of approaching the music. And Lee Konitz has a similar kind of approach, I think, to that too. But on that album, Pure Desmond, that was his first recording that he did with Ed Bickert from Canada. And it was also Connie Kay was from the Modern Jazz Quartet. He was the drummer. And Ron Carter. Ron Carter was the bass player in almost all the CTI, the Creed Taylor recordings that he did in the 70s. Those would be kind of that and the Time Out. Of course, I listened to Time Out because it was a popular album, and all over the place, and Take 5 was on it. But I don't think I really listened to a lot of the other Brubeck stuff until a little bit later. I do remember I had a CD, a cassette. I made a cassette recording of Paul Desmond solos with Dave Brubeck, but I had edited out all of the Brubeck stuff, so it was only Paul Desmond solos, and then I would fade it out, and so it was a couple cassettes worth of just Paul Desmond solos, and with Dave kind of taken out of there, because Dave's piano playing was never really quite to my taste. He was a little heavy-handed, and I really wanted to get it directly into Paul's playing and listen mostly to Paul all the time. And you'll read all sorts of different things where there's that allusions to that too. That's kind of what made the group work. They were really two completely different approaches, and so you had this light, lyrical, almost classical approach of Desmond, and this also classical approach, but a little bit more heavy-handed, both hands going, and dynamically a completely kind of different approach. So on that album, there were several standards, and one of the other recordings that is on this Peter Ind play-along is Mean to Me. Mean to Me is old standard from, I think, the 30s or something like that. I'll turn my speaker back on. So this is one of the tunes that's on that Pure Desmond album from the 1970s. So I think I'll close with this. So here's Mean to Me.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
Me. So it's on the Pure Desmond album. So in some of those articles I had mentioned, they're talking about specifically that 70s period. Hello, Deb Dawson. I see you there. It's a very small gathering we have here today. But I'm going to plan to go ahead, and because there's all of the bossa nova stuff that was done, bossa antigua, there's quite a few tunes that Paul Desmond wrote, but of course Take Five is the one that really everybody thinks of, and probably the one that endures the most of all the tunes. And I'll say Wendy. I would say after Take Five, Wendy, which is written on the chord changes of For All We Know. That's probably his second most performed tune. You can find several different versions of people doing Wendy and Take Five. Some of the bossa nova ones, Bossa Antigua, Embarcadero a little bit. People have done, you can find transcriptions online that they've done of some of these solos. And there's also play-along versions and things like that. So I'll talk a little bit about the bossa nova stuff. But I'm planning to do this next couple Mondays, so tell your friends. It's like we're all in these weird times together. There's, so much going on in so many different levels, so many different things that are kind of occupying our time, that I wanted to create something a little light, diversionary maybe, and for folks that are maybe fans of Paul Desmond's. I've posted this in KNKX on their calendar. I'll go ahead and leave this on my Facebook page. There's several other people. Bria Skonberg, great trumpet player, singer. She does a couple things weekly. Chick Corea's been doing some weekly stuff, and so everybody's kind of trying to find some different outlets and avenues for their music. I really enjoy doing jazz history, and had just started a jazz history class at Edmonds College, and we got 2 classes into it, and that's when the pandemic hit, right in the middle of March. And I had one scheduled for spring, got canceled. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that I can do there's one in the fall I'm supposed to do, another jazz appreciation course. And it was a lot of fun with a very receptive audience, and I've done a couple lectures up at Anacortes Public Library. Those have been a lot of fun too. Hopefully they'll get those going. I did one right before we did a concert, one of their second Sunday's concerts, right before the COVID thing kind of hit. So hopefully a few things will start getting back to normal. You can find a lot of live performances. Again, I mentioned Boxley's, Smalls in New York. They're doing daily performances there. The Village Vanguard just started doing weekend performances on Saturday nights and Sunday mornings for us here in the Pacific. It's 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Saturday nights, and 2 p.m. on Sundays, an afternoon matinee that they're doing. It was Billy Hart's quartet last week. Joe Lovano's coming up in a couple weeks. I'm looking forward to that. VJ Iyer, I think, is playing this week. So they're trying to get things going, and that looks like that's going to be the way things work for a while. There's a lot of online type of stuff. So I appreciate those of you that came and sat in. I'll do a quick sign off here. Have to play. Of course, if we're gonna talk about Paul Desmond, I'll do it without the play along thing though. But thanks again for coming. If you feel so inclined, do have paypal.me/bjensenjazz for gratuities. You can look for, actually I did a concert with Jamie Finley. It's been a couple months ago now. It's back in March. And I broke that into individual performances. There was a nice Take Five version we ended up with. So that's available on, it's either on my Facebook page or my B. Jensen Jazz page. So, all right, Deb, might get you back into practicing. So go back and practice your take 5. And thanks for coming, Mike and Deb. I see you in the chat over there. And maybe I'll see you next week. I'm going to do these the next couple Mondays at 4 p.m. I've got a couple other Desmond tunes I can play for you and talk about a little bit of Paul Desmond and take questions from the audience too as well. So thanks for stopping by, and stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll talk to you hopefully in real life and play together in real life soon.